Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Tanaka, and thank you to the Asahi Glass Foundation for organizing this event, Conditions for Survival. If early last year someone had said to me, there's going to be a heat wave in Russia this summer, and the average temperature in Moscow for the month of July will be 8 degrees Celsius above the norm, I would have said, I'm not a climate denier, but that's not realistic. But in fact, that is what happened. The heat wave that began in late June continued throughout July and into early August, did an estimated $300 billion worth of damage. By early August, 300 to 400 new fires were starting every day. Western Russia, was burning out of control. As a result of that heat wave and the associated drought, the grain harvest in Russia dropped from roughly 100 million tons to 60 million tons, a 40% decline. That costs the world 40 million tons of grain. But we were lucky, because if that heat wave had been centered not in Moscow, but in Chicago, and the U.S. had lost 40% of its grain harvest, the world would have lost 160 million tons of grain. World grain stocks would have dropped to the lowest level on record. Grain prices would have climbed to unimaginable levels. Food prices would have been rising everywhere throughout the world. Exporting countries would have begun restricting exports in order to control their food prices. The oil exporting countries, in all likelihood, would have begun bartering oil for grain to make sure they got the grain they needed for their people. And other countries, particularly lower income countries, would have been scrambling for whatever grain was left. The book is entitled World on the Edge, because I think we are much closer to the edge than most people realize. Some people say 50 years, some say 20 years. I think it could come at any time, and I use this example of the Russian heat wave being centered not in Moscow, but in Chicago. I'd like to talk a bit about our future today, looking at the world through a lens that is basically a food lens. First, on the demand side of the food equation, we're looking at record growth in demand. Population growth, 80 million a year. That means that tonight at the dinner table, there will be 219,000 people who were not there last night. And again, tomorrow night, there will be still another 219,000 people to be fed. So we have population growth. We also now have rising affluence in the world. We estimate that there are some 3 billion people in the world who are now trying to move up the food chain, consuming more grain-intensive livestock products. The third source of growing demand for grain is the use of grain to produce fuel for cars. In the United States last year, we harvested 400 million tons of grain. Of that, 126 million tons went to ethanol distilleries to produce fuel for cars. What this means, in effect, is that the world price of grain is now tied to the price of oil. This is the case for the simple reason that we are now, in effect, converting grain into oil. So as the price of oil goes up, the price of grain will follow. A decade or so ago, the annual growth in world grain consumption was about 20 million tons per year. In recent years, it has been 40 million tons per year. So the growth in demand is now stronger than ever before. At the same time, on the supply side of the equation, we're seeing new constraints on efforts to expand production. One of these is climate change. The rule of thumb that crop ecologists use for relating grain production to rising temperatures is that for each 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature, we can expect a 10% decline in grain yields. More fundamentally, world agriculture, as it exists today, has evolved over an 11,000-year period of rather remarkable climate stability. It is designed to maximize production with that climate system. But now the climate system is changing. So with each passing year, the agricultural system is more and more out of sync with the climate system. And I don't think we've yet grasped the full consequences of what this may soon translate into. So farmers have a new challenge now: climate change. They also have a new challenge in spreading water shortages. 18 countries containing half the world's people are now overpumping in order to meet the growing demand for grain. These countries include each of the big 3 grain producers: China, India, and the United States, and a number of smaller countries. In some countries, the overpumping, producing what I call a water-based food bubble, that is, countries that are overpumping in the short run to satisfy the growing demand for grain, but which will eventually, when the aquifer is depleted as a result of overpumping, will be forced to reduce the rate of pumping to the rate of aquifer recharge. We've seen Saudi Arabia, which was self-sufficient in wheat for more than 20 years, as a result of pumping a fossil aquifer, that is, an aquifer that does not recharge. And now suddenly that aquifer is largely depleted. Saudi Arabia's wheat production is in free fall. It's fallen by about half in the last 3 years, and in another few years, Saudi Arabia will no longer be producing wheat and will be importing all of its wheat and indeed all of its grain. The Arab Middle East, including Syria, Iraq, Yemen, among the more populous countries along with Saudi Arabia, is the first geographic region in the world where grain production has peaked and begun to decline because of water shortages. But the big examples of overpumping are India and China. The World Bank estimates today that 175 million people in India are being fed with grain produced by overpumping. Our estimate for China is that 120 million Chinese are being fed with grain produced by overpumping, most of the overpumping under the North China Plain. So we're looking at a world where we are sustaining growth in demand and growth in population by overpumping, which by definition is a short-term phenomenon. At some point, we will be cutting back, as Saudi Arabia is already doing. So on the supply side, we have climate change, we have spreading water shortages, and we now have a third factor, a shrinking backlog of unused agricultural technology. For example, here in Japan, which was the first country to launch a sustained rise in grain yields, doing this with rice beginning a century ago. In Japan, rice yields for the last 14 years have been flat. There's been no rise in rice yield per hectare. And the reason is a very simple one. Farmers in Japan are now using all the technologies available to raise rice yields. There are no new ones. In effect, farmers have caught up with scientists here. Now, what happens in China if China's rice yields, which are now almost the same as Japan's, if China's rice yields also plateau? Then we have two countries that account for over a third of the world rice harvest with yields no longer increasing. In Europe, wheat yields, which have been rising dramatically for some decades now, have plateaued in France, in Germany, and in the United Kingdom. So we have three countries in Europe, the three largest wheat producers in Europe, where yields are plateauing. Again, the reason is simple. It's not that European farmers don't want to raise rice yields further, it's just that they have caught up with the scientists. Scientists no longer have any new technologies to offer them to raise yields. These factors on the demand side and the supply side lead me to think that food may be the weak link in our system. We know from studying archaeological sites that more often than not, it was food shortages that brought down early civilizations, like the Sumerians, the Mayans, and so forth. And for a long time, I rejected the idea that food could be the weak link in our modern global civilization. But in recent years, I've begun to think not only that it could be the weak link, but that it is the weak link. And it is rising food prices that will be the first economic indicator to signal difficulty on the food front. And it is likely, I think, to be rising food prices that's going to provide the wake-up call on the climate issue. I don't think people understand very well the difference between 280 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere and 380 parts per million where we are today. But people do understand rising food prices. And that's where I think the wake-up call will come. As a result of the tightening food supply, we have seen the emergence in recent years of a new geopolitics of food. And I've written about this in some detail in the May-June issue of Foreign Policy magazine. We saw the first phase of this in late 2007 and early 2008 as world grain supplies tightened. We saw exporting countries start to restrict or even ban exports in order to keep their domestic food prices down. Among wheat exporters, this included Russia and Argentina. With rice, Vietnam was the most dramatic example because it banned rice exports for several months in order to keep its domestic rice prices down. And Vietnam is the world's #2 rice exporter. So what happened in that situation where exporting countries began restricting or even banning exports was that importing countries panicked because suddenly they realized they could no longer rely on the world market as a source of grain when they needed it. And the response was to begin looking for land in other countries that they could buy or lease long-term on which to produce food for themselves. As of last August, a World Bank study analyzing these land acquisitions, or land grabs as they are sometimes called, pointed out that there are at least 140 million acres. That would be about 55 million hectares, I think, in a quick calculation. But the area in these land grabs is greater than the area in wheat and corn combined in the United States. So they are certainly not trivial. And the principal targets of land grabs have been countries in Africa, importantly Ethiopia and Sudan. What the consequences will be, the political consequences will be over the long term of these land acquisitions is not clear. What we do know is that they are not only land acquisitions, they are also water acquisitions. And one of the countries that's going to be dramatically affected by this is Egypt. Egypt, as you may know, either imports its grain or imports the water to produce its grain via the Nile River. Essentially, it doesn't rain in Egypt. So if they can't get the water from the Nile, then there would not be any agriculture in Egypt. Now, what's interesting is that the Nile River is now essentially dry by the time it reaches the Mediterranean. That is, all the water that the Nile River provides is being used. But these land acquisitions in the Sudan and Ethiopia, which involve millions and millions of hectares, are most of them in the upper reaches of the Nile River basin. Ethiopia and the Sudan together occupy probably close to 70% of the Nile River basin. So these land acquisitions by countries like Saudi Arabia, South Korea, China, more recently India, and a number of smaller countries in the Arab Middle East, these land acquisitions are also water acquisitions. So as they begin diverting the water that normally would flow down the Nile, Egypt will find itself with a shrinking supply of water in the Nile with which to feed its 84 million people. So the politics of land and water suddenly become very complicated. The danger of this situation we're in is that it's beginning to evolve into a situation of every country for itself. Each country trying to make sure it has enough land and water resources somewhere in the world to satisfy its current and projected food needs. And where this will take us is hard to say. I mean, it's difficult to imagine people living in a country like Ethiopia, for example, or the Sudan, standing by while grain produced on their land is being shipped out of the country if they are themselves facing hunger and possible starvation. So how this is going to play out politically remains to be seen. It's an entirely new chapter in the fast-evolving food security, fast-changing food security situation in the world. If I were to pick, let me just check the time. If I were to pick 3 indicators that I think will tell us more about our future than any other, they would be: 1, an economic indicator, the price of grain. The second indicator would be a social indicator, the number of hungry people in the world. During the closing decades of the last century, the number of hungry people in the world was declining. Then, as we turned the corner into the new century, it started rising. It bottomed out at about 825 million people, has now reached over 1 billion people. And there is not anything in sight to arrest that rise in the number of hungry people in the world. That, of course, feeds political instability, Food prices were a factor, not the only factor, in the Arab Spring that we've been witnessing in recent months. The third trend that I would recommend watching, and it's a political one, that is the number of failing states in the world. We have been talking for some time about, we environmentalists, about saving the planet. But what's at stake now is more than the planet. I think the planet's going to be around for some time to come. What's at stake now is the future of civilization itself. That's why this conference on conditions for survival is really about civilization. It's not about the earth. The earth is going to survive. The question is whether civilization, as we know it, can survive the mounting stresses. In terms of what we do, we have developed at the Earth Policy Institute what we call Plan B. It has 4 components. This is what would be called the conditions for survival. Plan B has 4 components. 1, cutting carbon emissions 80% by 2020, not by 2050, which is what political leaders like to talk about. We think we have to cut them 80% by 2020 if, for example, we want to have a decent shot at saving the Greenland ice sheet. If we can't save the Greenland ice sheet, we probably can't save civilization. So that becomes, saving the Greenland ice sheet becomes sort of a metaphor. The second thing we need to do is get the brakes on population growth, accelerate the shift to smaller families, and try to bring population growth to a halt at not more than 8 billion. The third thing is to eradicate poverty. And that's essential for many reasons. For one, it's a key to accelerating the shift to smaller families and stabilizing world population. But it's also a key to the political stability that we need in the world, and which is being threatened by, among other things, rising food prices. So cut carbon emissions 80% by 2020, stabilize population by the time we get to 8 billion, if not before, eradicate poverty. And the fourth is to restore the economy's natural support systems: forests, grasslands, aquifers, soils, fisheries, and so forth. Cutting carbon emissions 80% by 2020 is part gains in efficiency, it's part shifting to renewable sources of energy. And the key to doing that, we think, is restructuring taxes. Lowering income taxes and raising taxes on carbon. No change in how much tax we pay. That remains the same. But over, say, the next decade, bringing down income taxes and raising carbon taxes. That would drive the shift from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy. And we know that we have an abundance of renewable energy in the world. Just to cite an example, a team of U.S. and Chinese scientists did a wind resource inventory of China that was published in Science magazine. They pointed out that China has enough harnessable wind energy to increase its current electricity consumption 16-fold. That's wind alone. The numbers are similar for the United States. Japan has enough geothermal energy to close all of its nuclear power plants if it decided it wanted to. Japan is one of the most geothermally rich countries in the world. How do I know that? Any country that has 10,000 hot baths has a lot of geothermal energy very close to the surface. Iceland, tiny Iceland, is developing its geothermal resources and wants to export electricity to Europe because it has so much geothermal electricity generating potential. I could talk about solar. Algeria points out that in its desert, it has enough harnessable solar energy to power the world economy. That sounds like a mathematical error, but it's not. The point is we have a lot of renewable energy in the world, far more than we can ever think about using. We need to harness that in order to develop a sustainable economy, in order to avoid a situation where climate change spirals out of control. The other things we need to do, stabilizing population, eradicating poverty, and restoring forests, soils, aquifers, grasslands, etc., is going to require additional expenditures. We estimate additional expenditures of about $200 billion a year. Now that's quite a bit. But what we're talking about are the changes needed to save civilization. How much is that worth? Well, one of the things that I think is now clear is that we need to redefine security. We have inherited a definition of security from the last century that was dominated by 2 world wars and the Cold War. And so in Washington, if you talk about national security, people automatically think of military expenditures. But if we were to sit down today and ask ourselves, what are the principal threats to our security in the 21st century? On my list, it would be climate change, population growth, spreading water shortages, rising grain prices, failing states. On my list, armed aggression does not even make the top 5. It might make the top 10, but it doesn't make the top 5. The threats to our security in the 21st century are very different from those in the 20th or the 19th centuries. So we need to rethink and redefine security. And you begin looking at the $200 billion of additional expenditures I talked about to reach the Plan B goals. It would take almost 1/3 of the U.S. military budget to do that, or 1/8 of the global military budget. We can't say we do not have the resources to create the conditions for survival, or to use our Earth policy language, to reach the goals of Plan B. We do. We have the resources. What we now need is leadership. And that's why conferences like this are so important, and why I'm so grateful to you for having invited me. Thank you very much.